الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to another episode of Quran Circle 11, where we listen to Quran as usual and focusing more on the subject of women in the Quran, some of the ahkam, some of the rulings, some of the figures that are mentioned in the Quran, and things of course of great benefit. And this is not intended for us to get to know all of the matters of rulings and matters of fiqh and what's related to this, but rather to get an idea and to see the miraculous nature of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, this perfect way of life that governs our life in every aspect of it, and to humble ourselves because this is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so never to question the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with regards to these rulings. And we're still in Surah An-Nisa, and Surah An-Nisa meaning the Surah of women. That's what An-Nisa means. So some of the ahkam, some of the rights, some of the rulings are mentioned in the surah related to this. So continuing with what has been mentioned before and starting with verse number 116 from Surah An-Nisa. But before we start, I would like to introduce the reciters with us today. We have Sheikh Ayman Abdul Mun'im. Welcome to the program. Barakallah feekum. And Sheikh Ahmad Rajab. Barakallah feekum. And Sheikh Abdul Khaliq Atiyah. Jazakumullah khairan for coming, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you all. So listen attentively inshallah ta'ala and open the mushaf to follow, so also to correct the recitation. And we'll start inshallah ta'ala with Sheikh Ayman Abdul Mun'im and verses 116 to 122. 116 to 122. Go ahead inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. إن الله لا يغفر أن يشرك به ويغفر ما دون ذلك لمن يشاء ومن يشرك بالله فقد ضل ضلالا بعيدا. إن يدعون من دونه إلا إناثا وإن يدعون إلا شيطانا مريدا لعنه الله وقال لأتخذن من عبادك نصيبا مفروضا ولأضلنهم ولأمنينهم ولآمرنهم فليبتكن آذان الأنعام ولآمرنهم فليغيرن خلق الله ومن يتخذ الشيطان وليا من دون الله فقد خسر خسرانا مبينا. يعدهم ويمنيهم وما يعدهم الشيطان إلا غرورا. أولئك مأواهم جهنم ولا يجدون عنها محيصا. والذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات سندخلهم جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها أبدا وعد الله حقا ومن أصدق من الله قيلا.
MashaAllah, barakallah feek, jazakumullah khairan. As you see here in these verses, with regards to what's mentioned about women, it's related. But first, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make this clear to all humanity that the unforgivable sin, if a person dies upon it, which is a shirk, associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala after the message had reached. Any other sin, if a person dies upon it, did not repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from it, either a person will be forgiven, or if he's punished, then eventually he will enter the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But associating partners with Allah, this is something that would make the person in the hellfire forever. And this is basically what the verse 116 states. That's why this is the far away deviation. And that's why it's the reason for that is that a shirk, or associating partners with Allah, is against even the pure nature of the human beings. So with the message of all of the messengers of Allah, they called the people to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And in reality, those who associate partners with Allah, call upon other than Allah, worship other than Allah, they are just invoking, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, inathan, or females, as the people of Quraysh, they would call the idols that they worship, Allat wal-Uzza, female names, وَإِن يَدْعُونَ إِلَّا شَيْطَانًا مَرِيدًا, and they're basically invoking the shaitan, Iblis, the devil. And this is how he deceived them to worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cursed shaitan, Satan, and he said, meaning the shaitan, that he would have a portion of his people. Shaitan took it upon himself, as we know, that he would lead the people astray to enter the hellfire with him in the day of judgment. And those who are protected from the shaitan are the believers, because it's only whispers. It's nothing but whispers and adorning the evil, if they hold fast to the book of Allah and the wahy revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the shaitan, he took it upon himself that he would deviate the people, give them false hopes. And that's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exposes the ways of shaitan that is hidden from us. So don't trust every hope that you have. It might be a false hope from shaitan to deceive the person away from what they have been created for, whether it's in sinful ways or permissible ways that takes the person away from fulfilling the purpose of their life. And he would command them to cut the ears of the cattle as a way of associating partners with Allah, and also to command them to change the creation of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created men to be men, created women to be women. So when people, they try to change the creation of Allah, this is all from the ways of Iblis, the ways of shaitan, Satan, to cause this. And when people would do non-permissible means, where they would change the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with surgeries, with other things, this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade, and the details of that is for people to refer to the people of knowledge. And whoever take the shaitan as a protector besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he had incurred upon himself a great loss, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of all things. The Quran gives us the matter very clear. So either a person would follow the shaitan, the devil, or to follow the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whoever follows the shaitan, then shaitan would lead them astray, and the final place of that person will be the hellfire, wal-'iyadhu billah. That's why the shaitan, he promises them, he gives them false hope, whether if they give in charity that they would be poor, if they repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would lose their status and things of that nature. And it's nothing but deception, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala stated, and these are the people of the hellfire. And as for those who believe and do righteous good deeds, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will protect them, will make them among the people of Jannah. And this is the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the truth, and no one is more truthful than Allah. And as you see the verses, after mentioning how the shaitan is with the whispers and giving hopes, and false promises, what opposes all of that is al-iman, faith, and the righteous good deeds. This is how a person protects himself from the plots of the shaitan. We continue inshallah ta'ala with the next set of verses, which is 123 to 127. And Sheikh Ahmed, go ahead and recite for us inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ليس بأمانيكم ولا أماني أهل الكتاب من يعمل سوءا يجز به ولا يجد له من دون الله وليا ولا نصيرا ومن يعمل من الصالحات من ذكر أو أنثى وهو مؤمن ومن يعمل من الصالحات من ذكر أو أنثى وهو مؤمن فأولئك يدخلون الجنة ولا يظلمون نقيرا ومن أحسن دينا ممن أسلم وجهه لله وهو محسن واتبع ملة إبراهيم حنيفا واتخذ الله إبراهيم خليلا ولله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض وكان الله بكل شيء محيطا ولله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض وكان الله بكل شيء محيطا ويستفتونك في النساء قل الله يفتيكم فيهن وما يتلى عليكم في الكتاب في يتامى النساء اللاتي قل الله يفتيكم فيهن وما يتلى عليكم في الكتاب في يتامى النساء اللاتي لا تؤتونهن ما كتب لهن وما يتلى عليكم في الكتاب في يتامى النساء اللاتي لا تؤتونهن ما كتب لهن وترغبون أن تنكحوهن والمستضعفين من الولدان وأن تقوموا لليتامى بالقسط وما تفعلوا من خير فإن الله كان به عليما.
ما شاء الله, barakallah feek, jazakumullah khairan for this beautiful recitation. And here, as you see in the verses, when it comes to men and women, the people of the book, Jews, Christians, Muslims, the matter is not up to them. It's not upon their wishful thinking. This is all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's all about their actions. So when people claim things, and this is one of the things that human beings, they're very good at. They claim that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves them. They claim that they're righteous. They claim that they're truthful. But then when you see their actions, it's far from that claim. For every claim, there is truthfulness to it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying in the Quran that it's not according to your wishful thinking or the wishful thinking and the hopes, the false hopes of the people of the book. And then He subhanahu wa ta'ala says, whoever do evil, they will be recompensed for it. And they won't find any help or support from anyone. because if it's not from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they won't get anything. And that's why those who do righteous good deeds, and this is what matters. So it's not wishful thinking. Those who do righteous good deeds, whether they are male or female, and this is here the point of reference, min dhakarin aw untha, whether they are males or females, while they are believers, they are the ones that will be admitted into Jannah, and they would never be treated with any injustice whatsoever, even if it's the smallest thing. And this is really the rule of justice that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. It doesn't matter whether you are black or white or strong or weak or rich or poor or anyone. As long as you are upon what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from you, then you are the best. And this issue of, or the criteria of who's the best and so on, it's not for people, for human being to be superior over others. This is only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. But everyone is to be treated with the justice that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded the people to be upon. And then after that, it shows that there's no one better than someone that submit himself. The best religion, the best way of life is the one that aslama wajhahu lillah. Someone that submits his face and his body to Allah. Submission when it comes to the actions, matters of belief, actions, worship, relationships. While they are good doers, they do it for the sake of Allah, as if they see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If they don't see Allah, they know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees them. And they follow the way and the religion of Ibrahim alayhi salam, in which he was Hanif, and that means he turned away from associating partners with Allah to be upon the oneness of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took Ibrahim alayhi salam as Khalilan, the closest that a person can be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because of his devotion, because of his oneness of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the sacrifice that he did for the sake of Allah. And to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala belong what's in the heavens and what's in the earth, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encompasses everything. And also the verses says that they ask you, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, with regards to women. So this is yastaftunak, and yastaftunak is asking for a fatwa, asking for a hukm shar'i, asking for a religious ruling. And this is when a person asks the people of knowledge. So they asked the Prophet ﷺ with regards to the women and how to deal with it, especially with what's mentioned about the orphans, where the man would have an orphan that he is a guardian for, and then they used to, either he wants to marry her and then he would make or do an abuse as a result of that by not giving her her rights, or to prevent her from getting married because he doesn't want anyone to share the money with him. So they asked the Prophet ﷺ, and what's mentioned in the book with the answer of this with regards to the orphans among the women, those who do not give them what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordained and made it as an obligation to be given to them, they want to marry them. So the answer was made clear to the people. And also with regards to those who were weak among the children and among the orphans, and to establish justice when dealing with the orphans. Because the orphan does not have someone to protect them, to support them, because they lost their father before the age of puberty. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encouraged the believers that whatever goodness that you do, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the all-knower of it. So to remind them and to show also the rights of women that is being observed, and that right came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, commanding the people, if they are believers, to submit themselves to the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in such a way. Then after that, we'll go through verses inshallah ta'ala 128 to verse 134. 128 to 134. And Sheikh Abdul Khaliq, please go ahead and recite for us inshallah ta'ala.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وإن امرأة خافت من بعلها نشوزا أو إعراضا فلا جناح عليهما أن يصلحا بينهما صلحا والصلح خير وأحضرت الأنفس الشح وإن تحسنوا وتتقوا فإن الله كان بما تعملون خبيرا ولن تستطيعوا أن تعدلوا بين النساء ولو حرصتم فلا تميلوا كل الميل ولن تستطيعوا أن تعدلوا بين النساء ولو حرصتم فلا تميلوا كل الميل فتذروها كالمعلقة وإن تصلحوا وتتقوا فإن الله كان غفورا رحيما وإن يتفرقا يغن الله كلا من سعته وكان الله واسعا حكيما ولله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض ولقد وصينا الذين أوتوا الكتاب من قبلكم وإياكم أن اتقوا الله وإن تكفروا فإن لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض وكان الله غنيا حميدا ولله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض وكفى بالله وكيلا إن يشأ يذهبكم أيها الناس ويأت بآخرين وكان الله على ذلك قديرا ولله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض وكفى بالله وكيلا من كان يريد ثواب الدنيا فعند الله ثواب الدنيا والآخرة من كان يريد ثواب الدنيا فعند الله ثواب الدنيا والآخرة وكان الله سميعا بصيرا.
ما شاء الله, ربنا يبارك فيك. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. So these verses in the beginning talks about if the woman fears that her husband doesn't like her, she's afraid that he's not going to fulfill her rights. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says then there is no harm for both of them to find a way to rectify the situation with goodness from both sides. And this is a very important condition that is mentioned there. That means if she, for example, she would undermine some of her rights for the sake of keeping her husband, and she's okay with this, and he's okay also with that, not just in general for anyone to do this, but in a very specific situation here. Why? Because to bring people in peace together, this is something that has so much benefits in it, instead of breaking the marriage. So, and this is one of the objectives as you see in the verses of the Quran. And either the issues comes from the husband or from the wife or from both of them, and there's solution for all of them. And to take the extra step to make sure that they save the marriage to the best of their ability, so that the last resort is divorce. So this is one of the meanings here that is mentioned. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminded the human beings and both the spouses that the greed is present in oneself. So people need to overcome this greed and to look of what is best for their situation, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from them, and to be patient. Life is not about fulfilling one's dreams or one's wishful thinkings or whatever there is. Life is about doing what is right. And if it happens that you get what you desire, mashallah, this is great. But there are other people involved in one's life, and we have to really make sure that we do not transgress the limits, and to also have the concern towards others. For example, someone wants a divorce, whether it's the husband wants a divorce or the wife wants a divorce, for their own sake. And sometimes they overlook the benefit of the whole matter, and maybe they can keep the relationship with goodness to be there, and the same thing with the children. And this is basically what the verse is calling them to be upon, and those who are upon goodness and fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is well acquainted of what they do. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also saying to the men that no matter what they do, they cannot really be perfect, fair, or the fairness cannot be perfect when it comes to women dealing with them if a person has multiple marriage. Therefore, that refers to the inclination in one's heart. So as a result of that, do not incline towards one and ignore the other. So as if she's hanging there, not married and not divorced. So divorce, that's why a person is commanded to be just to all of them. And that's a condition that we mentioned before. If a person wants to have more than one wife, that he has to be just physically when it comes to every matter, whether it's spending time with, whether it's financial responsibilities. And the word al-islah, and rectifying the situation and bringing things to be upright, it's repeated because that's again the objective, not just the personal desires and the personal greed. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most forgiver, the most merciful. And if the last resort is the only thing that they can take, which is basically to separate with divorce, after taking these means, and this is a very important matter to consider. Many people, they just resort to divorce right away, the first stage or the first solution to them. But rather, if they follow what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran, and that's important for people to learn what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us, and nothing works, and they took all of the means and everything is not really doing any benefit, then in that case, if they depart from one another, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give them from His bounty subhanahu wa ta'ala. So as if it's praising their state if they depart, it's only after they take these means. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make it easy for both of them. And in some situations, marriage cannot go further. But with making sure that they would exhaust every mean to make sure that they save it. And since everything belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether it's relationships, whether it's physical matters, non-physical matters, and that's why with the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for them to fear Allah, for both men and women to fear Allah in their relationship, in their obedience to Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that He admonished and commanded and bequeathed the people of the book before us to, and yourselves, to have the taqwa of Allah. This is the wasiyah, this is the bequest of the first and the last, is to be obedient to Allah, to be watchful, and therefore to be steadfast upon the deen of Allah. And if you disbelieve, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala belong to Him what's in the heavens and what's in the earth. And it's repeated in these few verses many times to remind the people that everything belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you need to observe that, to humble yourself, to submit yourself to the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's the most rich subhanahu wa ta'ala. To Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala belong what's in the heavens and what's in the earth. And sufficient is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a person to rely upon. And if He will subhanahu wa ta'ala, He can make you completely removed from the face of earth. And He would replace you by others. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is able to do all things. So don't think that you're all that when you are upon the state of sins and disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You are in this life being tested for you to be upright, for you to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is no honor and dignity for you unless you are obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No goodness unless a person is righteous and obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that can never be attained unless a person is seeking rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, even for those who want the goodness in this life, if you are someone that wants the thawab and the rewards in this life, who's the owner of this life and the hereafter? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَعِنْدَ اللَّهِ ثَوَابُ الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ. By Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the reward in this life and in the hereafter. So also it's a call for those who wants goodness in this life. Who's the owner of this life? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So turn to Allah and be obedient to Allah because He's the owner of all things. And وَلَا يُنَالُ مَا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ إِلَّا بِطَاعَتِهِ. No one can attain what's with Allah except by being obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He's the all-hearer, the all-seer subhanahu wa ta'ala. Really, it's amazing how the verses are put together in such a way that talks about rulings and disputes in the marriage and things like this, and then all of that is related to admonishing the hearts and the fear of Allah, and to bring what is right, and to direct the people not to be like others where the concern is the greed and one person's desire, but rather what is the best, what brings the best in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be pleased with. This is basically what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us, and therefore we need to humble ourselves and to be obedient to Allah and seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all of our affairs, and one of which is in these relationships. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us and to protect our families and our ummah from the evil within oneself. Before we end, I would like to thank the reciters. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for coming and reciting these beautiful way of recitation. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept from all of us. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم ثم تلين جلودهم